The topic obviously has gotten a lot of press recently. There have been some very well-known examples. Orange County recently, Mercy Housing experienced some tough stuff here in Temple City area. A community of friends, great developers, had some struggles with a recent project. So we've been very successful in LA at getting funding passed, which is a long way towards progress, H and HHH, and now the real hard part of getting actual developments built on the ground in communities where people are concerned about lots of different legitimate topics and some that maybe people aren't feeling are so legitimate. And so this panel is going to talk a little bit about sort of how that issue of sort of bringing democracy to the ground works. And we talked a little bit at the outset, just sort of the notions that people have about how our democratic process works, and it plays itself out really strongly in this way. So with that, we're going to just jump right in. I'm going to skip everything else I was going to say, get us back on time. You know, the debate, and this is maybe where Mike was saying, is the debate is really premised, especially the recent bill by Scott Wiener and others at SB 827, for folks that aren't familiar with it, would have removed a fair amount of zoning power from local governments. And there have been other bills that are sort of like what Mike described in terms of really trying to shortcut certain aspects of the CEQA process that people feel like aren't being used appropriately or need to be addressed to kind of get to faster delivery of affordable housing or moderate income housing or whatever it would be. So it's premised on the notion that really the process of getting projects approved is a major cause of the affordability crisis, both affordable and just sort of in terms of overall housing supply and production. Mike had a lot of good data on that point, just in terms of how much we're underproducing. So what's your sense of the premise that the participatory process or the democratic process is at the heart, or at least a significant cause of what we're facing in terms of a housing crisis in California? And therefore, how does that affect your sense of the proposed solutions? And I start with you, Zeb. Does that make sense? Or?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, great. I was steered in that direction. Yeah.
Well, obviously, we live in a democracy, or what we think is a democracy. What does that mean in the context of land use? Or anything else. I speak as somebody who was a practitioner of this for 40 years. People aren't as dumb as the political class think they are. People are actually pretty smart. And a smart politician would listen to people and try to figure out what are their aspirations and what are their frustrations. And they won't look to poke them in the eye, but they'll look to try to find common ground on issues. When we talked a couple days ago, in the last few years of my term as a county supervisor, I don't know how many chronically mentally ill homeless projects we funded, and thus I took the political responsibility for it, because without the county's funding, they wouldn't have been built. In Hollywood, in Santa Monica, in Venice, in Van Nuys, and I didn't have one neighborhood that rose up against it, not one. Now, how did that happen? Chronically mentally ill homeless. Well, the first thing is I didn't go to Westwood Village and propose to put a mentally ill homeless unit in project in Westwood Village, because it would have been inappropriate. But there are people, and SB 827 is one that's motivated by an ideology that the single-family home is a thing of the past, and it's a vestige of racism and bigotry and all that stuff. And that's a point of view. I don't share that point of view. But when you do think, when you have an issue, a problem, a challenge you want to address, you can either make a statement, an ideological statement, or you can try to solve the problem. So we look for places where we have minimal resistance. That kind of is a human, it's common sense. And so we built homeless projects on Sunset Boulevard, west of La Brea Avenue, where we converted a motel into a chronically mentally ill homeless facility. We did the same I partnered with Yvonne Burke when she was a county supervisor, one on Washington Boulevard in Culver City, on 26th in Colorado and Santa Monica, and so forth, on and on. And we didn't have a single NIMBY, so to speak, NIMBY. Why? Because we listened to the community. We listened to what their issues were, and we took those issues off the table. And if you're going to do something revolutionary or something that's going to change the nature of a piece of property or a neighborhood, it's incumbent upon an elected official or a mayor or an administrator in the city to vet it with the community. And you can usually take 80% of the issues off the table. I've done that hundreds of times in my career, where I go to the neighborhood and I say, look, We're going to build a senior housing project at Cedros and Dickens, which we did when I was a city councilman, on the air rights over a city-owned parking lot, something I pioneered when I was a councilman. We built about a half a dozen of them. Why the city doesn't build, lease the air rights over their multitude of blacktop parking lots that exist all over the city of LA, and basically eliminate land costs and partner with nonprofit housing developers, I don't know. But we did a bunch of them. And one of them was in Sherman Oaks, and it violated it. In order to make it work, it had to violate a 3-story height limit. It was going to be a 7-story building. I went to the president of the association, Richard Close, who some of you I'm sure have dealt with, and I said, Richard, when I ran for the city council in 1975, the #1 issue on my platform was senior housing. So that issue is not on the table for discussion. We're going to build this project. It's going to exceed 3 stories. Now, whatever else you want me to consider, setbacks, flora and fauna that we're going to build about that, we're going to maintain the parking for the public. We don't need to provide as much parking for seniors as you do for everybody else because they don't drive as much. So whatever other issues you want to bring to the table, I'm open, I'm all ears. But we're going to build the building. And Richard Close to this day tells me, and he told my successors who represented Sherman Oaks, do what Zev did. He didn't shine me on. He came to me and he told me what the bottom line was. And as long as I knew what the bottom line was, and that I had something to contribute to the discussion, I was satisfied. I knew that we had to build senior housing. Look, the people of the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles, you don't need to take another poll. They voted over 70% to tax themselves, robustly tax themselves, for something that will not be to their direct benefit. Right? That tells you something. They have a conscience. They want to do something about it. When you go to city council, Jeff was showing me the article in this morning's paper. I didn't read this morning's paper because I had to fight.
There is still a paper.
There's still I had to get up at 5 in the morning to get to Westwood from Fairfax. But the Koreatown issue, even the LA Times, which has been pounding on the city for this controversy that exists down on the neighborhood, for pounding on the idea, they even acknowledge that the city did not really vet this with the community. And that's a big mistake. And you're asking for trouble when you do that. So my answer to the question is, to your question is very simple, a la Mencken. When you treat people with respect and with dignity and with, assume a level of intelligence, they will reciprocate. When you treat people like dirt, when you ignore them, when the government ignores the public in a democracy, and sometimes even not in the democracy, then they're going to reciprocate with you. And they're going to harass you. They're going to come to meetings. They're going to beat you up. I have an old axiom that when a politician comes to a community meeting and he can't find a parking place, it's not going to be a good meeting. I live for those days. To come to a meeting, I've said this many times to my students here, I felt like a preacher, a proselytizer, a religious proselytizer. My religion was government, and it was my objective when I came into a hostile crowd to convert those people from their religion to mine, that government can work. But how do you do that? You got to gain their confidence, and sometimes that involves compromise. But we have a crisis. We need to be intelligent about the way we handle the crisis. One-size-fits-all solutions, sledgehammer solutions, are designed to get the response that 827 got, that the Koreatown project got. You got to be a little more sophisticated, a little more nuanced, a little more intelligent about how you address this issue, and we can talk about that later. I'm sure you'll talk about it later. There are multiple ways to increase housing in Los Angeles. It's not going to be done by rezoning all of the Los Angeles basin from all of the single-family homes in Los Angeles basin into the equivalent of an R4 zone, 100 units to the acre or more. There isn't even a density in that bill. And it does nothing for affordability, and that's the last thing I want to say. We don't have a housing crisis in California. We have an affordable housing crisis in California. And most of the apartments that are being built in California and in Los Angeles today aren't doing a thing for affordable housing. 42 or 43% of the people who live in Los Angeles County, household households in LA County have an average income of less than $60,000 a year. Almost a quarter of them have a household income on the average of less than $30,000 a year. The rent control battle that we had in Los Angeles in 1978 was over middle class and senior citizens, white middle class and senior citizens that were being priced out of their homes. But they weren't one rent increase away from being homeless. They had a savings account. They were middle class. Today's crisis is among the lower income population, which make up almost half of the population of our county and probably even closer to half of the population of the city. And when you build market rate housing at $2,500, $3,000, $4,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment, you're not doing a darn thing for the people who can't afford a fraction of that. And now I know the response to that is, well, you got to increase the supply, and it'll eventually bring the price down or stabilize the prices. Well, the people who are now in crisis don't have that kind of time to wait. And I dispute the fact that you will ever have enough supply to bring the price down. The price is only going up. Professor Michael Storper at the UCLA Luskin School, the Urban Planning Department, has written about this and talked about this, that actually the market rate, the increase in market rate housing is driving the cost up. It's not just in Los Angeles, it's in Seattle, it was in Vancouver. So it's a very complicated problem. One-size-fits-all solutions don't work. We really have to understand and diagnose the problem while encouraging. Oh, and one last thing I want to say, tax incentives, federal tax incentives. One of the biggest problems that we had in mid-'80s with that tax reform, I think the real estate people in this room know this better than I do, is it retarded incentives to build multiple residential housing, and then most recently the cutbacks in tax credits for affordable housing. That will do, you know, all the granny flats, and I'm a big fan of granny flats, but all the granny flat ordinances in the world will not replace what was done by the tax reform, so-called tax reform law, which made it less likely and less economically viable to build affordable housing. That's
all right. Great. Good start. Good. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to turn to Ann, and Ann, you're going to add some complexity to the solution or to the problem.
So a little bit going back to the issue of democracy, and totally agree that it's probably better to people with respect than to treat them like dirt. You know, always an excellent starting point.
we agree on that.
Yes, I do agree on that. So I work for the California Community Foundation, and my boss teases me that I don't think he's teasing. That my job is to shove LA. So I spend all day long thinking, I've mind melded with the parking lot attendant in City Hall. He's just like, whatever, go ahead. You know, when we set out to do HHH, we didn't actually set out to do HHH. We set out to take the city from 300 to 1,000 permanent supportive housing units a year. And that was triggered by the mayor saying, we need $100 million to address the supportive housing problem. We don't have $100 million, but neither do the developers have a pipeline, so we're kind of in the same place. And we all thought they would have a pipeline if there was any hope of money. So we just set out to basically provide the early money and have them start. It was originally kind of a challenge to City Hall, and that became City Hall pointing out that we would have to go to the voters to make this work. And we discovered the power of polling as a foundation. And in 1 year, with various elected officials, we funded 12 polls. And I have, as a mother, I call polls the ultrasounds into the minds of the voters. You know how it's such a thrill when you get to see that baby in there? It is really a thrill to be able to see that mind of the voter. So one of the things that we did, you know, you always have a little bit of room in polls to throw some extra questions in. So when we were working on HHH, you know, and it was clear that the voters were, you know, housing ranked above safety, above jobs, above, you know, fire and police. It was like the #1 concern. One of the things that struck me in one of the polls was when we asked people, do you fear that you or your family member could become homeless in the next year? And 52% of people who were low income said yes, but 30% of people who made between $60,000 and $90,000 a year said yes, which kind of speaks to even the middle class doesn't have that cushion that you mentioned, Supervisor. So So it felt deeply as a risk by so many people, and that makes them, really eager to find the solutions. So one of the questions that we threw in one of our HHH polls was, do you think, basically we took linkage fee and translated it into voter language, do you think developers should pay a portion of, their profits or whatever towards affordable housing? And people like 75% of people were like, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. So a year later, when we were pushing for the linkage fee and the city council was like, oh, whoa, we're not so sure about that, we were like, we've already been down this path with measure JJJ, which you guys didn't think up and you were not really happy with, and it was polling place planning, which, by the way, included the transit-oriented communities zone, which has been widely successful and totally embraced by the development community and will produce, right now it's at over 4,000 units in the pipeline, over 1,000 of them are affordable with no subsidy. And that's sort of the smart version of 827 as we've been pushing it. But anyway, we reminded the city council members that the voters have gotten into the habit of being able to take complex issues. They rejected Measure S, which was scary. If you go up to most of your neighbors and say, do you like developers? Not very much. Do you like City Hall? Even less. And it was scary that we thought that Measure S would pass, but it didn't. The voters were smart, to your point. But it did give City Hall two places where we've seen the democratic process kind of goose City Hall into doing the right thing. One was around the linkage fee, because we did have strong polling around that. And the other was around the recently approved and then subsequently CEQA challenged permanent supportive housing zoning ordinance, where we were able to say to each of the council members who were possibly concerned about the reduction in parking or all that, we could do this using Scott Wiener's SB 35, approval, which is not as elegant, or we could do this the more elegant way. And so people really did, I think, embrace the idea that you're getting pressure that tells you that the will of the people is solve this darn problem. And so we're, I think, willing to take a little bit more in the way of chances.
Right. So with that as a backdrop and just sort of thinking about the broader conversation that we have here, we've got, the discussion of the YIMBY movement. We've got the NIMBYs. A lot of the debate is really being shaped by traditional media, this whole thing. Social media, lots of other. So talk a little bit, Jeff, about just sort of how you think the media is shaping our sense of both the topic, the solutions, the actors, how we ought to think about the participatory democratic process. Like, how is that helping or hurting us?
Well, first of all, Doug, congratulations on putting this panel together this day. I think it's been fascinating. What a great group you've got. Secondly, the issue of democracy, your overall topic, is one that has been with this republic from the beginning. The founders, as you recall, as people here know, if they don't otherwise know it, they've hopefully seen Hamilton or listened to music. The founders were very skeptical of a certain level of democracy and so forth, and yet they believed in government. They believed in a representative government. They believed in levels of democracy. So the nature of democracy is always changing, the exact details of it. And sometimes we're happy with it, sometimes we're not, but the fact is we're a lot better off, and I think Mike's comments about China were a pretty good illustration of that. You could live in a world where you have, 100,000 new units next year, but is that a world you'd want to live in? It's not the world we want to live in. So I think we, in a way, have to be thrilled that we have a democratic system. The thing is, it is changing, and that's the nature of what you're talking about. It's always changing in various ways, but some of you may know that in a New Yorker article shortly after the election, Barack Obama said Barack Obama, whose campaign for president in 2008 we thought was a new media campaign, said how glad he was that he didn't run in 2016 because social media had so changed the landscape. The fact is social media has changed the landscape in profound ways. And so at my little center at Crosstown University, we looked at one of your experiences, the Golden Motel episode. And in a way this is representative, I think, Doug, in a way maybe it's special, but I think there's a lot of lessons from it, because the Golden Motel was a place which itself was unsafe, and unsafe to the community. And it had several police calls, sheriff's calls a week going on there. And there was drug dealing and all the rest. And so, your group had the wonderful idea of converting it into affordable housing with terrific elements to it. But what happened? Ultimately, there was tremendous community opposition. Now, I realize there were also financial issues, but there was tremendous community oppositions, which I don't think Mercy Housing saw coming. Well, where was it coming? It was coming in social media. And so we've looked at this. For example, I don't know how many, just out of curiosity, hands, how many of you are members of something called Nextdoor? But the Nextdoor you're a member of has nothing to do with the Nextdoor that somebody sitting next to you is. There are like 3,000 people in your Nextdoor community. It's very targeted to your community. Nextdoor became a major organizing operation against the Golden Motel, and I don't think you guys were, if you didn't have a lot of people living there who could be in Nextdoor, how do you rebut the stories that are going out, which I think were largely false stories, or at least put a different narrative in there? I don't know how many people in your organization read Weibo, but it's a Chinese language social media site. Tremendous organizing was going on in Weibo. If you weren't there, not only didn't you know the conversation was going on, but you couldn't rebut the false things that were being said. And so I think that, and by the way, we also looked at the more traditional publications, including print, and the print publications, and I come from a certain perspective on this thing, but I don't think made the arguments that I would have liked to see in the arguments about why this was a good project, why it would be safer for the community. None of that was being said. So I think it's extremely important. Going back to Zeb's point about working with the community, there are all kinds of layers of ways to work with the community. But in this area of social media, and it will keep evolving, it's going to keep changing, you have to be every place where people are. And they're not in the places that they were when you were elected or when Mike was elected to the city council. They're in different places, and you have to be in all those places, know what people are saying, and I think find ways of addressing their legitimate concerns the way that Zeb was saying he did with Richard Close, who had legitimate concerns.
Okay, well I'm gonna shift us a little bit based on that and go back to your parking lot. So if social media is the new parking lot, and you can't really tell how many spaces are available for the elected official, I mean, this is a tough issue for us, right? So on the one hand, we're asking developers or folks to kind of go out and develop affordable housing, and on the other, and I don't disagree with anything you said, Jeff, we're saying you got to be in all these places that we traditionally aren't, right? And absolutely, organizations like Mercy Housing should be people that have a diverse enough staff to be able to see all the different social media in different languages, and I completely accept that. But it's a tall order, right, for every developer to be in all these places. And I guess the question I think that's being asked about these rules is democracy's always been messy, but as our technology around participation change, and the way in which we interact with government has changed, are there processes, are there things about the way we structure the discussion around whether or not to approve a project or move housing forward that also need to change in acknowledgement of sort of the shift? Is that part of what we need to think about, or is that not the real issue in your mind, Zeb?
The tactics have changed and will continue to change, as Jeff said. The bottom line is the same. I'm not familiar with
No, that's fine.
the
It's just one example of many.
But I've had enough of them
Yeah.
to know how that works. I'll speak as a former elected official. As an elected official, it's my job to have good intelligence about what's going on in my constituencies. And if you've been around long enough, and this is one of the downsides of term limits, if you've been around long enough, you know what the reaction of certain things is going to be to the community. You know who the movers and shakers are in the community. And so when you want to build a project, who do you go to? You go to your financiers, right? You got to talk to your financiers, and they give you a hard time, and they're not going to lend you this, and you get more collateral, whatever. You don't say too much democracy in the financial industry. You got to negotiate with them because they've got you.
I think we'd be for more democracy in the finance. Nobody's asking us those, but yeah. All right, fair enough.
Okay.
All right.
Well, it's a good idea that's come out of this conference.
All right, there we go. Chalk one up.
And so you have a checklist of things you need to do to tee up your project. One of the things that you need to do, you collectively, people who are going to build, is to community relations. I mean, there are actually firms who get paid to do this. I got paid to do it as an elected official. And the first thing I do is I talk to your elected official. I talk to the police department, the police precinct in the area. I just do a little intelligence gathering about the community. And then see what you see what the reaction is to you have a proposal. A proposal like the one you described is the same exact thing that we did on Sunset and Formosa. We took an old whorehouse, a motel that had been a whorehouse for 30 years or more, where the Sunset, as many of you old-timers will remember, was prostitutes walked up and down Sunset, and that motel was one of the places that the prostitutes took their tricks. And so when we went to the neighborhood council and to the councilman of the district and to the Chamber of Commerce president, et cetera, there was no homeowner association there, but there was a neighborhood council. And we said, we want to take whatever the Formosa motel, I forgot what it's called, and convert it into a chronically mentally ill homeless thing. The answer, and the plus is we're going to get rid of the hookers. And one of the magnets for the hookers on Sunset Boulevard is 2 blocks west of La Brea. And you see the smile on their face. Really? They'd rather have chronically mentally ill, and there is still a big stigma to mental illness, right? They'd rather have a mentally ill, chronically mentally ill homeless permanent supportive housing project on Sunset and Formosa than they were willing to have what was there before, the motel before. But the way we were able to do it was we went to them first. They didn't hear about it in the local newspaper. They went to them first. Now, Doug, you're never going to satisfy 100% of the people, right? You can never do that. But if you can get a critical mass of people to either neutralize them or come to support you on something, and you still have a marginal group of people who are against you, that's enough for an elected official or for the city to say, you know, we're going forward. And today, as you said, you don't even have the polls now. Now you have the poll, the election poll, which shows this overwhelming support for this. And that's why I think Herb Wesson, who I saw last night, represents that part of Koreatown, which is all in controversy. He's feeling pretty emboldened about this. He has the wind at his back. He's going to make this work. He's going to negotiate with the neighborhood. Should have done that early on, but he's not walking away from it. And sometimes you have to make that call as well. But the thing I would recommend to all the developers in this room, as important as it is to talk to your bank and as important as it is to talk to your architect and your contractor, talk to the community. It'll save you a lot of trouble down the line. And it'll give your elected representative who can make trouble for you at the local level, it will give him or her the ballast to back you. It's frustrating, and
I appreciate your comments. I'll just say for those of you that don't know, because this is sort of a time-honored tradition in the affordable housing industry, and I think you're describing it well, like to pick the least popular thing in your neighborhood and go after it and say, I'm going to turn it into something good. And in fact, that was the goal of the motel, and it was recommended by the chief of police locally to us as the thing to do. So I think...
Where was this?
It's near Temple City, but I don't want to make it about this project. I think it's more a broader issue, which is that you can do those strategies, and the best of us, Mercy's had a community...
Unincorporated. Oh, sorry.
We've had a person on our staff for 15 or 20 years doing what you described, Zev, and I think not all of us are good at it. Some of us are better at it than others. Some of us do better jobs on different projects than others, but I don't think that those techniques are necessarily new to the field, and looking out at some of the other practitioners, I think this is what we generally do. But something really has fundamentally shifted in my mind. I think part of it is that it's hard to figure out the public that's talking about it. That may be one part of it. But Ann, you've been around it. There are a lot of experienced developers who know the tricks of the trade and do a lot of work with electeds and do this sort of stuff and are still facing a different type of problem than they used to, I would say.
So when we were working on the HHH campaign, one of the things that various people kept saying is, oh my God, it's going to be so hard to cite, to find locations and build this stuff because there's going to be so much opposition. And I thought, well, these developers are already doing 300 units a year. They're going to, triple it, but that's not infinity, and it's a big city. It's not going to be that hard. And within the first 6 months, I realized why I was both right and wrong. And I would tell you that as of today, we have 1,965 units against a goal of 2,000 by December in the pipeline with letters of approval from their council people and funding approved, and they're in the financing process. And the developers are telling me they are going faster through the process than ever before. So, yay. But what was happening originally was people were going to even the most committed, best council members. I mean, they're all lovely. We love each and every one of them. But they were going to the ones who had campaigned for it and being told, ew, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to have all the units in my district. And the light bulb went off that more resources actually makes it harder in some ways. Because if you only have enough money to do one project every 5 years, you can take that political hit, even with term limits. But if you have enough money to do 3 projects in your district in a year, you're like, uh-oh. So that's where our partners at United Way came up with the 222 campaign, where every council member signed a pledge to do at least 222 units in 3 years. That totals 3,000 across all the districts in their district. And if you go on everyoneinla.org, there's actually a dashboard with the pictures of the council members showing how many units in their district are approved in the HHH pipeline, and that changes every week. And people are enthusiastically embracing it because there's not that sense of it's going to be just me, so-and-so isn't taking them in his district. So I think that's helped a little bit. The other, I would just, to Jeff's point and the sort of impact of social media, one of the things that I think we as voters and whatever need to hold our elected officials accountable for is making sure that anonymous voices on social media are not given more credence than actual human beings. Because we had this experience at the Community Foundation this year when Senator Wiener was pushing 827. There was a closed Facebook page that it took my 26-year-old assistant 15 minutes to get admitted to, called Greater LA, that was basically a 827 YIMBY proponent. And they were incredibly offended by, and I see Cynthia here, hi, by Alliance for Community Transit LA's written letter of opposition to it, signed by 27 organizations. And people on that Facebook page were like, wait a minute, the senator's staff said on this page 3 weeks ago that they were willing to entertain, comments and concerns. It's like on a Facebook page that's not even open to the public. So, somebody on that page took our tax returns and figured out how much money we had given to those 27 groups that signed it and said, see, we told you the Community Foundation is the puppet master behind, the opposition and blah, blah, blah. And I was pretty much ignoring all this until it migrated onto our Facebook page and they started calling us hypocrites, at which point my communications director had to introduce me to the meme. If you haven't seen it, you're like as old as me. I can't go to bed yet, honey. Someone is wrong on the internet, because I was pounding away at the keys. And she was like, why don't you just step away and let me handle it? And she basically wrote something that said, we fund ACT LA and its members because they serve, people who make less than $35,000 a year, who take the bus, who are the working backbone of LA County. And while we've only taken a position on 3 measures in 103 years, we do take a position every day on the democratic process. And so the next day, the senator's staff called and said, we would like your help in talking to the right people. So they did step out of the internet and into real life, but how do we make sure that that happens? Because for my 27-year-old daughter, who, by the way, moved back home, and I blame you, all that slow growth thing has come home to roost in a really bad way.
Oh yeah, Los Angeles is really slow growth.
Yeah, so anyway.
Can't get a contractor.
For that generation, what happens on the internet is as real as what we are doing right here. So how do we actually translate that into the political process?
That's great. So this sort of, I think the other thing that I think people note about the pounding away on the keyboard is just the way you get so outraged on social media, and just all these articles lately about just sort of the degree to which we're not mildly unhappy about things or mildly happy. We're now either like ecstatic or totally postal, and this seems to be the way that social media works. Or some of the stuff, the degree to which you can get yourself worked up and upset and the things you say. But what I also note is that people on social media, they're absolutely convinced that the elected official is firmly, or the foundation, is firmly in the pocket of somebody. But it's always the pocket of the person that they're, the other side. So if they're developers, they're absolutely in the pocket of all these neighborhood activists that are opposing their project. If they're neighborhood activists, the developer's always got the elected official in their pocket. So talk for a second. You've got this article in front of you, Jeff, about sort of the way in which elected officials have this veto power, at least city council members here. How is it our impressions of how, campaign finance reform, access to power, the notion of whether elected officials are really doing what Zeb describes as like listening to their constituents. How's that shaping our ability to take this on?
Well, I think there are a lot of layers here. For one thing, going back to the social media thing for 1 second before I get to the campaign finance and so forth, there is a tone to the debate on the internet that some of us don't like. I hate it. And so some people don't want to stay up late at night and read it, much less respond to it. Some people don't want to have their names out there being vilified by cruel and often unfair things, but even the fair things that are said about them. And in a way, I think we all need to have if you're going to be in the battle, you have to have people prepared to go out there and fight that battle. It may not be pleasant, but you've got to find the right way to do it. Maybe it means you go high while they're going low, but you got to be in that. You have to be out there in that debate. And in the era of polarization that we're in right now, it's always been, there have always been, you and I were talking about sort of alternative newspapers, the Bay Guardian, and I worked for the Village Voice. We always hated everybody. So there's always been that kind of paranoia about elected officials. And about developers and about community groups that are powerful. There's always a group against it. But the fact is that to some extent that's a fringe, and it's a fringe that has to be dealt with. What you don't want is that fringe would be legitimate. And I think the concern that I would have is to try to make most people feel that you listen to them, that such charges just weren't true and weren't fair. And there is the risk with these letters that all of a sudden, no council members in this room, but former council members, but that some council member starts going to developers and says, you get a letter from me, but only if you've contributed X amount of money to my next campaign or hired my sister-in-law or whatever it is. And then that gets discovered. And that story becomes the way people think of those council members, or think about the political process, or think about the California Community Foundation, or as most of you know, I'm at USC, which has had its own reputational problems recently. So those things happen, and I think that you have to make them not let them become legitimate, Doug. I guess that's the thing. The claims are going to always be there's a risk to them, but don't let them be legitimate. And so if, for example, these letters are here, I would say to any developer in the room, don't become part of a process, I'm not saying anybody here would, with a city council member where you're doing something that can be seen as being pernicious instead of being wholesome.
All right.
I can just say a word about the letters.
With that, Mike, will you come up and,
The letters from the councilman, I wouldn't have put that in that ordinance or whatever the measure that created this process was, because it's subject to criticism for exactly the kind of criticism that we've had from the press. However, if I was a general manager of the Department of Housing or whatever the appropriate department is at the city, the first thing I would do when I wanted to site a homeless facility or a temporary shelter is I'd go to the councilman's office. Of course I'm going to go to the councilman's office for two reasons. Number one, he or she knows the neighborhood. And number two, if they don't like it and I haven't talked to them, they can make my life miserable. So I'm going to talk to them like I'm going to talk to a lot of other people. They're stakeholders in the process. So I think more was made of this than should have been made
To
out
be
of it.
clear, it wasn't in the ordinance. What year did you leave the city council, Councilman?
A long time ago.
I know,
Before
but-
you were born.
No,
1994.
I'm sorry, I worked for this, I was your interim head of housing in 1995, so you had just
I
left.
missed you, yeah.
Just missed you, but it was so in 1995, certainly when Mike was there, it has been the practice. It isn't in the ordinance, it's just in custom and practice.
The letter of acknowledgement.
The letter of
No,
acknowledgement.
But I thought the letter of acknowledgement is something very recent.
Nope. Oh, no.
then we're talking
Everybody
about
here
the
who's ever
different
tried to get a project approved in LA City, raise your hand. And, I mean, honestly, I have, Mike, am I right? You have to get the letter of acknowledgement going back since God was a baby, and
Well,
probably.
the story today says that there's state legislation that is going to be introduced which would get rid of letters of acknowledgement. Is that a good or bad idea?
Well, it wouldn't, is the problem, unless you actually make it like illegal and immoral, and then you're still going to have to get your council member to wink at the housing department or something, because the practice is each council member basically has to approve on whether it's a planning decision or a funding decision or whatever, what goes on in their district. So
Well, but why is that such a shock?
it's not. I mean, maybe it's a shock to Emily, who wrote the article, but I don't think so.
Whether there's a letter of acknowledgement or not, the fact is, if you're a developer and you want to go build a housing project, one of the first things you're going to do is talk to the council office, or to the mayor's office, or to a county supervisor's office. That's common sense. And to cut them out of the process is really, this gets to the fundamental title of this panel, of this conference, about democracy. That's part of the sausage making. You got to vet these things. You got to get the. It'd be suicide for a developer of any kind to do a project that was going to change, the contour of a neighborhood, or this, and certainly affordable housing or housing project. It would be suicide not to talk to the people who represent the area, including the homeowners associations and the tenants groups in the neighborhood, et cetera. I don't see that as a
but that
big
practice
deal.
is true in the city of LA in a way that it is not true in other cities.
That's
I
probably
think
true.
on that point, let me just open it up to Q&A. Mike, I saw you shaking your head. Len, do you have a question or a comment? I'm going to call you out.
What about development is different than countless other economic choices, choices that we make to change the contour of our lives and our world that involves directly electeds and non-electeds, if you think about neighborhood groups, in that decision making and gives them veto power? Like what is it inherent about that?
There's nothing inherent about veto power. Let me be clear, and maybe we're talking about two different things, and I'm not sure that we are or not. I'm talking about if the zoning and the community plan by right gives you the right to build a project, forget whether it's affordable housing or not, housing project, an apartment building. Zoning allows you to build a 30-unit apartment building, and it's consistent with the plan and the zone. No, city councilman shouldn't have a veto power. You should be able to go to the building department, submit your plans, get the permit, and go to work. But what I'm talking about, and I think you know that I'm talking about this, is the cases where developers come in and seek to change the rules. And everybody in this room who's in the development business knows exactly what I'm talking about. That's where you get the controversy. Not the only controversy, but that's where the predominant controversy is. I have forgotten more than you'll ever know about developers who come in and buy and pay twice as much for a piece of property because they think they can get the city to rezone it by double, whether it's commercial or retail or residential. And that's what drives people crazy in the neighborhoods. So what I say to you and to developers generally, now you're not a developer, is play by the rules. Don't game the system. You want to game the system, you want to change, you want to come in and seek a spot zone change like they had in Koreatown, they had all over town. It happens every day. The LA Times reported that over 90% of the zone changes that are requested by developers are approved by the city council. So it's not like the city council is anti-development. Over 90% approval rate for spot zoning. In my day, Mike's day, spot zoning was a curse word. You just didn't do spot zoning. You want to change the community plan, you take a decent area and put it, and contextualize the land use. But just because I know the councilman, or I've lined his pockets with campaign contributions or other kinds of contributions or payments, and I get him to change the zone on one corner, that's wrong. And that's where there ought to be an uprising.
Okay.
So by right, no. If you play by the rules, the city needs to play by the rules, as long as everybody's playing by the same rules.
You know, the crisis I think we really have is affordable units. I think you hit it right on the nail. You know, we keep hearing about just housing, whether it's market rate or high end. In Santa Monica, one of the problems we have these hotels that are trying to reinvent themselves, and they want to become 5-star hotels, but they want to attach and break a little bit of the rules and go up. You know, we have some height requirements, especially along the beach, and want to double their size, but include these high-end housing units, condos for the most part. And I've been really objecting to that because that doesn't really address our issue. And in many cases, some of the housing that they're looking to build is really for international folks. that maybe live in Santa Monica a month out of the year, which doesn't do anything for the housing crisis in Santa Monica specifically. You know, we're about 92,000 residents that actually live there. Our daytime population is about 350,000 because of tourism, and we're a job center. We don't have enough housing. People don't live in Santa Monica, but they work in Santa Monica. And it hasn't really changed in the last 40 years, you know, our population. So I think the real key issue is, and I know some of the cities are looking at this, and maybe we should have more electeds, especially in these smaller cities, talk about inclusionary housing and making sure that we enforce 30% affordable units as you developers look to build more housing. And I don't mind you breaking the rules if you're going to address the issues of affordable housing, true affordable housing.
We were all brought up to believe that breaking the rules is bad. We should not break the rules. The rules of zoning in the city of LA, and perhaps, I can't remember, Santa Monica, were, I think, last updated in 1965, something like that.
That's not true. It was updated in the mid-1980s citywide.
Not,
Imposed
well,
by
yeah.
state legislation.
Yeah,
Maybe
okay, I'm getting
283.
fonder of Scott Wiener by the moment here. So, you know, I mean, the reality is it takes a huge lift. We have 35 community plans in the city of LA that we need to update, and we've done one, the Hollywood area, and now we've, I think, approved 2 more. And that's under CEQA, you know, attack. So the whole break the rules thing has a morality sound to it that probably should not apply when you're trying to address a housing crisis. And we have underproduced housing in the city of LA. So I just, you know, I totally agree when it comes to high-end condos on the beach or whatever, but let's be realistic. Collectively, if you ask ourselves who's the villain in this story, we collectively are, because we haven't kept our plans updated to, you know, reflect the needs that we all have, and that is why we are paying the penalty with 27-year-olds cooking vegan gluten crud in our kitchens because they've moved back home. So.
Can I ask a question of the panelists? I'd love to know what you all think of Mike's suggestion, or not suggestion, but the idea that was surfaced about changing CEQA in some way.
I think it's a non-starter. I think that what we tried to do with the permanent supportive housing zoning ordinance is make all those things by right so that you don't trigger CEQA as much. I think you could do a lot of things to fix the impact of CEQA without taking on the neutron bomb that is get rid of CEQA or something.
I want to ask a question about funding. There's a lot of disagreement about market rate housing, and I think that was interesting, but if affordable housing is the only thing that we're going to do, just to build the affordable housing for the people in LA, the city of LA who currently qualify, would cost the GDP of Los Angeles. So where is the money going to come from? If that's the only thing that we're going to do to solve this, where is that amount of funding going to come from?
I'm gonna ask Ann to answer that quickly, and then we're gonna go back and give you guys closing comments. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
So the first thing you have to do is make it a lot cheaper to build units, and I do not mean, with all due respect, shipping containers or things like that. I mean things like the transit-oriented communities ordinance, or, you know, reduce parking, increase density, increase reliability, you know, sort of predictability. And then you need to take that unit. I think Mike Costa figured out for me the other day, like, what's the very lowest you could get your cost down to if you were trying to do workforce housing, and you got it down to like 300,000 or 250 or something. And then you go from that with subsidy down to what you need. As I mentioned, in the TOC ordinance, we're seeing 1,000 unsubsidized units for extremely low and low-income people come out of that. So it's not, and you know, the other thing I would point out is that we are subsidizing me and probably everybody on this panel. You know, the mortgage interest deduction is 4 times what we spend on affordable housing in this country. So, we need to get rid of the shocked tone that it would cost money, because we are spending that money. We're spending it on the wrong people, including me.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna give everybody a little closing comment here, but I'm going to switch it up on you because we've sort of already taken the closing question that I have. So let me just ask you this, and it's a little bit of a challenge, so you have to stay within my parameters or not, depending on your perspective. You got a minute and a half each, and the question is this: let's just take the premise that even good projects that do good community outreach sometimes run into opposition. And even folks that reach out to their elected officials and their other folks sometimes hit the buzzsaw, and the processes that we have in place lend themselves to lots of different outcomes, but one of those can be dramatically slowing projects or making it difficult to know whether a project will be approved. Without the expectation that every project should be approved, I don't think we need to say that, but what's one change in the way public participation or the democratic process works around land use that you think would make a big difference and be overall positive from a democratic standpoint? So not Mike's authoritarian, Singaporean paradise necessarily, I know that wasn't what you were saying, but something that you honestly think would further our democracy, but sort of shift the question a little bit from how many people show up on Nextdoor and how many people can pack a parking lot to actually, what gets us closer to solving this from a democratic process perspective? I did not give them this heads up, so I'm going to start with Jeff because he looks the
Okay.
most attentive.
Thanks. I'm fascinated in the narrative about the homelessness right now, which is just a component of the affordable housing issue. And I'm afraid that all the votes that we had that were terrific for these initiatives, that the public will think that it didn't work and will turn against it. And I'm also worried about people who feel that something's being improperly put in their neighborhood changing politically. So I think the narrative, what I'd like to do is to see a narrative formed, which I think is a correct narrative, about the generosity of the people of Los Angeles and the good things that are happening. Ann talked about 1,900 units. That's not being reported. What's being reported is the places that they can't build. So speaking as the media person in it, I think from a democratic standpoint, I'd like to much more celebrate the successes and try to have that be part of the narrative.
Great. Mike, you want to go ahead?
If I were not here at this conference, but in a classroom or studio at Cal Poly Pomona, and this question came up, I think that I would talk about the fear of the unknown. That is, a lot of the potential opponents of projects base their opposition on a perception or a guess of what a proposed project is going to be like. And that to the extent to which the students in our school, architects, planners, and others, can do a better job of conveying to the public what the change is actually going to be like, that actually might reduce the pain level or the anxiety that people feel. Because back when I was on the council and had to deal with opposition, I frequently found that people assumed the worst. People assumed that whatever was coming was inevitably going to be worse than what they had. Therefore, there was a kind of a default position of opposing what's new because it's definitely going to be worse than what they currently have. So for those who want to change cities, I think we have to be able to show that the changes that's coming is actually going to be better. In some ways, architects can do this with drawings or renderings. I think there are ways in which nonprofit housing developers or advocates can find other ways to show how the change is going to be better. But I think that's the key to a lot of this in terms of overcoming the fear of what's coming.
Great. Zeb?
There are a lot of things. Let me just mention one thing. I thought that what was going to come out of the defeat of Measure S, at least that's what the city fathers and mothers promised, was that there was going to be an aggressive redo of the master plan of the city, the community plans of the city. I don't think it's going to reach their target date, 6 years, whatever it was, for a chunk of the plans. But if there's one thing I would change, there was a decision that was made years ago, decades ago, involving a high-rise office building right here on Wilshire and Glendon called the Friends of Westwood case. Up until that point in time, CEQA only applied to actions which required a discretionary approval by the city. or the county, whatever level of government it was. That case, that building, which was a by right building, at least that was the argument that the city made, the courts ruled, and the appellate courts ruled, and it stuck to this day, that any project of significance, and I think the city defined it as any residential building of either more than 30 units or more than 40, 50, okay, 50 units, and any building that is more than 30,000 square, 50,000 square, so it's changed.
You have your own land use attorney now.
So, all right, well, I got to be brought up to date, it's been a while, that they are subject to CEQA. So that meant that even a project that was consistent with the plan, consistent with the zoning, but that exceeded these thresholds was subject to being battered around. I would try to figure out a way legislatively to correct that. But coupled with that would be to really aggressively develop the master plan, the community plans, go through the very painful process that it will be, the give and take within communities, and then enshrine them and then stick to them. I had a constituent once, Charlie Melhorn, who was a World War II fighter pilot. He said, "Zev, plan the flight and then fly the plan." That usually works maybe 80, 90% of the time. Sometimes there's a need to change, but for the most part, plan the city and then let everybody play by the same rules. I think developers, to me, have said to me over the years, we just want to know where we stand. The uncertainty is killing us. Neighborhood groups say the same thing. We just want to know where we stand. You know, this spot zoning, this pop-up stuff is killing us. And so I think there's really more commonality here if we have a set of rules and we communicate that to people. I think everybody, and that has to include increased density. There's capacity that's underutilized and unutilized in the city today, and there's also potential for increasing capacity where it doesn't exist today, but it's got to be done in an intelligent way and not in a one-size-fits-all way, because you're going to get what you got with the Wiener Bill, where people are going to just rise up and say nothing to anything. One of the last thing I want to say about this, the proponents of the Wiener Bill said, well, at least it started a discussion going. And that's a good thing. And one legislator who shall remain nameless, who's kind of on Wiener's side, said this was a disaster because now everybody suspects every housing bill that's coming out of Sacramento, and they're putting it under a magnifying glass, and it's going to set back more responsible efforts. So we got to be intelligent about this, and we're not going to. This problem didn't get created overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight, but it's got to be solved the right way. Because if we make mistakes, they can't be corrected.
Great. And last comment?
So I don't know if this is at all feasible, and kind of going back to the article in today's paper. I am on Nextdoor. It really makes you sad for humanity. I think we should call it housing for lost gray kittens instead of people. But I noticed, so projects are going up in my neighborhood. I live in, Zev's former district. And they are 4 stories, ugly little boxes, and they are just market rate, and they just fly through. The neighbors kind of grumble a little bit, like, is there enough parking, whatever. But that's it. And they go up, and you drive around, and you're like, another one, yay. You're kind of right. There is development going on. And we need to be aware and honest about the impact of classism and racism and whatever else. When you mention affordable housing, maybe not when you mention disabled, mentally ill people, whatever, but affordable housing, all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I need to pay attention, and it's suddenly a huge thing. I think if we said that, and we certainly could do this with housing for chronically mentally ill people, because everything that makes you eligible for that is a protected class. But if we just were able to say, you do not need to disclose when you are an affordable housing project, you are just an apartment building like everything else, and it is between you and your God what you're going to put in there, then I think you'd see a lot more streamlining of production, because everything that brings people out, they talk about the fenestration and they talk about the gardens and they talk about whatever, but what they're really concerned about is, are those people going to be good neighbors, and are they going to have the same values around this neighborhood as I do?